Welcome to the History Max podcast. A young man is running for his life. He is just entirely exhausted. His muscles are failing. His breath is basically tearing at his throat. He is fleeing the forces of the Nanda king, who at this time is the most powerful ruler in northern India.
Right.
And finally, he just can't take another step. He collapses in this dense forest and immediately falls into a deep, heavy sleep. And while he's unconscious, a massive wild lion emerges from the trees.
Yeah, it's quite the image.
It really is. The lion approaches this sleeping man, but instead of, tearing him apart, the beast just lowers its head, gently licks the sweat from the man's exhausted body, and then quietly walks away, leaving him completely unharmed.
Which is, it's a very specific account that comes to us from the ancient Greek historian Justin.
Right.
And it's a narrative vignette designed to serve a very deliberate political purpose. I mean, it frames this moment of divine intervention, right? A clear omen of royal destiny for a man who, at that exact time, was just a hunted outcast.
And that sleeping man was Chandragupta Maurya, who, of course, survives that forest to become the founder of the Maurya Empire. So, for you listening, we're going to examine the period from roughly 320 BCE to 185 BCE.
Yes, a massive span of time.
And this is a really pivotal era.
Yeah.
Because it's the very first time the Indian subcontinent was unified under a single centralized government.
Yeah, it's a complete paradigm shift.
We are charting this massive transition from a fractured landscape of competing regional states, which were known as the Mahajanapadas, into this colossal political entity that spanned from modern-day Afghanistan all the way over to Bengal.
And, the shift in governance required to manage a territory of that scale is just profound. Before Chandragupta, South Asia was this patchwork of independent republics and kingdoms.
They all had their own ways of doing things.
Oh, absolutely. They had their own localized administrations, their own specific currencies, their own militaries. So to fuse those disparate regions into a singular imperial structure, it required the invention of entirely new methods of resource management and intelligence gathering and social control.
So we are essentially looking at the mechanics of ancient statecraft here, examining how this unprecedented level of centralization was achieved, and frankly, looking closely at the immense physical and societal costs required to maintain it.
Right, because it was not cheap in any sense of the word.
No, it wasn't. So let us start with the founder himself, Chandragupta, and that encounter with the lion, because, a story like that does not exist just to be entertaining. It's a piece of propaganda.
Precisely. It legitimizes a ruler who possessed an incredibly unorthodox background for a king in ancient India.
Unorthodox how?
Well, to understand why he needed a narrative of divine favor, we have to look at the rigid social structures of the time. The Vedic tradition, which heavily influenced the region of Magadha, where Chandragupta ultimately built his capital-divided society into varnas, or distinct social classes.
Right, the caste system.
Yeah, and rulers and warriors were traditionally drawn exclusively from the Kshatriya class. They were born into a lineage of power and military authority. It was inherited.
But the historical records consistently indicate that Chandragupta was not a Kshatriya.
He was a profound outsider. The consensus across various traditions points to low-born origins. Certain Brahmanical texts suggest he came from a Shudra lineage, which was the lowest of the four primary varnas.
And they were typically associated with laborers and service providers, right?
Exactly. Alternatively, specific Jain traditions identify his family as Maurya, which was a community of peacock herders.
Peacock herders. That's a long way from a throne.
Very far. So in either scenario, he had absolutely no traditional inherited claim to rule. For a man of his standing to seize control of the most powerful kingdom in the subcontinent was just a massive disruption of the entire established social order.
So he needed a story.
He needed a story like the lion to signal to the populace, and particularly to the entrenched elites, that his authority was sanctioned by forces higher than mortal tradition.
Right, like the gods themselves chose him, so you can't argue with his birth.
Exactly. But, divine favor only gets you so far. He also needed practical, ruthless strategy.
Which he certainly did not formulate entirely on his own. Because whenever the historical texts mention Chandragupta, they almost always pair him with his mentor and chief strategist, a man named Chanakya.
Also widely known as Kautilya, yes.
Right. And Chanakya is effectively the intellectual architect of the Maurya Empire.
He really is. If Chandragupta was the face and the sword, Chanakya was the mind. His approach to warfare and statecraft was highly pragmatic and deeply psychological.
There is a specific anecdote from Jain texts that perfectly illustrates how Chanakya
For
operated.
the siege. Yeah.
Yeah, so during the early days of the rebellion, Chandragupta and Chanakya are trying to overthrow the Nanda Empire. And they march their forces to a specific Nanda town, but the town is heavily fortified.
Very thick walls.
The defenders refuse to surrender, and this prolonged siege begins. And a direct military assault on heavily fortified walls is incredibly costly in terms of manpower and resources.
Well, and a protracted siege drains the attacking army's supplies and morale just as much as the defenders.
Right.
Chanakya recognized that brute force was not the optimal solution here. He needed a vulnerability that could not be reinforced with stone or wood. So he turned to the psychological state of the townspeople.
Which is where it gets really clever. He disguises himself as a mendicant, a wandering holy man, dressed in rags, carrying a begging bowl.
And he physically infiltrates the besieged town.
I mean, try to picture the conditions inside those walls. The food supplies are dwindling, the water might be contaminated, the smell of cramped, terrified people is overwhelming.
Panic is setting in.
The population is desperate for any sign of hope or divine assistance.
And once inside, Chanakya observes the local customs. He notices that the townspeople are deeply devoted to the Saptamatrikas.
The mother goddesses.
Yes, these are 7 mother goddesses whose shrines are located within the town walls. The populace firmly believes that as long as these goddesses are present, the town simply cannot be breached.
It's a spiritual force field.
Precisely. The physical walls are secondary to the spiritual protection they believe they have.
So the disguised Chanakya begins preaching, and the desperate townspeople, seeing this holy man, approach him and ask what they must do to survive the siege.
And what does he tell them?
He tells them that the presence of the mother goddesses is actually drawing the enemy's wrath, or perhaps that the goddesses need to be moved to a sanctuary outside the conflict zone to properly protect them.
Right, he spins it.
Yeah, he convinces the town's leadership to physically remove the shrines of the Saptamatrikas from the town.
And the townspeople comply. They dismantle the shrines and remove the idols, and the moment the goddesses are gone, a psychological collapse occurs.
Because they think they're defenseless now.
They genuinely believe their protective shield has vanished. Panic sets in, the defensive coordination falls apart, and the Mauryan forces easily overrun the town without having to endure a massive, costly battle.
It is brilliant, and it is entirely manipulative. I mean, he takes their deepest faith and weaponizes it against them.
And this specific tactic establishes the foundation for how the Mauryan state would govern. It prioritized intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and exploiting the specific granular vulnerabilities of an opponent over simple, direct confrontation.
It's the application of maximum leverage with minimum physical force.
Exactly.
So, using that exact brand of calculated leverage, Chandragupta and Chanakya eventually defeat the Nanda dynasty and take control of the kingdom of Magadha. But right around this time, a massive geopolitical shift occurs just to their west.
Alexander the Great?
Yes, Alexander the Great, who had pushed into the northwestern corner of the subcontinent, dies. And he leaves behind this fragmented network of Greek governors and generals in the Punjab region.
And that power vacuum presents a monumental opportunity. Chandragupta moves his forces into the northwest, capitalizing on the unrest among the remaining Macedonian and Greek factions.
He just swoops in.
He does. He successfully integrates the Punjab into his growing territory. But this expansion eventually puts him on a collision course with one of Alexander's most capable successors, a general named Seleucus Nicator.
Seleucus had spent the years after Alexander's death consolidating his own vast empire, stretching from Mesopotamia all the way to the borders of India.
Right.
Which leads to the Seleucid-Mauryan War, occurring roughly between 305 and 303 BCE.
It is a major clash of 2 immense military machines, and while the specific tactical details of the battles are sparse in the historical record, the outcome is decisive. Chandragupta defeats Seleucus.
And the treaty that concludes the war is highly consequential.
Oh, massively. Seleucus is forced to concede significant territory, specifically the easternmost satrapies of his empire.
We are talking about regions far beyond the Indus River. The Mauryan borders are pushed deep into modern-day Afghanistan and Baluchistan.
In exchange, Chandragupta gives Seleucus 500 war elephants.
500 elephants.
Which Seleucus desperately needed for his own ongoing conflicts back in the Mediterranean world. But The territorial acquisition fundamentally changes the nature of the Mauryan state.
Right.
They are no longer just a powerful northern Indian kingdom. They are an interregional empire spanning incredibly diverse geographic and cultural zones.
Let us pause here and map this out.
Mhm.
Because when you look at historical maps and textbooks, empires from this era are usually depicted as solid blocks of color.
Right, big blue blobs.
Yeah, a map of the Maurya Empire will show everything from Afghanistan to Bengal shaded in a uniform solid blue. And that visual implies that the emperor, sitting in the capital city of Pataliputra, exerts total unyielding control over every single square inch of that blue space.
And that is a fundamental, deeply entrenched misconception of ancient statecraft. That solid block model applies more to modern nation-states with strictly defined and patrolled borders.
So how should we picture it instead?
For an entity like the Maurya Empire, historians utilize a different conceptual framework, often referred to as a network model or a galactic polity. The most accurate visual analogy to understand how they actually controlled this vast territory is a spider web.
A spider web. Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that.
Picture the anatomy of the web. In the center, you have a dense, compact body that represents the imperial core.
Right.
For the Mauryas, this core was the region of Magadha, specifically radiating out from the capital city Pataliputra. Within this core, centralized administrative control was nearly absolute. The emperor's decrees were followed, taxes were collected efficiently, and the military presence was overwhelming.
But the empire stretches thousands of miles beyond Magadha.
And that is where the legs of the spider web come in. Extending outward from the core are long, spindly threads. These threads do not cover the entire landmass. Rather, they represent the major vital arteries of the empire.
So we're talking about the primary trade routes, the navigable river systems, and the strategic military highways.
Exactly. So the state projects its power in narrow corridors. The Mauryan administration focused its resources on securing these specific lines of communication and commerce.
Right, because that's where the money is.
Exactly. And to maintain control over these long threads, they established heavy anchors at strategic points. These were the provincial hub cities.
Cities like Taxila, which is situated far in the northwest, Ujjain, located in the central plateau, Kalinga, positioned on the eastern coast, and Savarnagiri down in the south.
Those cities served as the nodes of the network. A royal prince or a highly trusted governor would reside there, backed by a significant military garrison. As long as the capital controlled those nodes and the roads connecting them, they controlled the flow of wealth and information across the subcontinent.
Which means there are massive spaces between the legs of the spider web.
And that is the crucial point. The areas between the trade routes, the deep forests, the arid deserts, the rugged mountainous terrain were not micromanaged by Mauryan bureaucrats.
So who was living there?
These vast interior regions were inhabited by heavily armed, relatively autonomous tribal societies. The Mauryan state claimed overarching suzerainty over them, but the day-to-day presence of imperial authority was virtually non-existent.
Basically, the emperor simply did not care what happened in a remote forest clearing, as long as the tribes living there did not disrupt the flow of caravans on the main highway 5 miles away.
Precisely. The state optimizes for maximum extraction of resources along the routes, while largely ignoring the difficult-to-govern territories in between.
But even just managing those nodes and routes across thousands of miles requires immense coordination. Let us look at the machinery of the state. How do you govern a spider web of that magnitude?
You build a bureaucratic behemoth. To manage a state that spans multiple languages, climates, and economic zones without relying solely on the constant threat of a moving army, you need a highly structured, fiercely loyal administration.
Right.
And the highest-ranking officials in the Mauryan government were known as the Tirthas.
And the compensation for these top-tier bureaucrats was staggering. Texts note that a Tirtha could receive a salary of 48,000 panas.
To understand the weight of that number, we have to understand what a pana is. A pana was a silver punch-marked coin possessing a very specific standardized weight. 48,000 of these silver coins represents an astronomical accumulation of wealth.
So if you compare that to the wages of an average agricultural laborer or even a foot soldier in the army, the disparity would be massive.
It was designed to be massive. The state was effectively buying absolute loyalty. When an official is paid that much, they have zero financial incentive to accept bribes from local warlords or to stem from the regional tax collection.
Because they'd be risking 48,000 silver coins.
Exactly. Their wealth and their status are entirely dependent on the survival and efficiency of the central state.
And what exactly are these highly paid officials managing day to day?
Almost every conceivable aspect of civic and economic life along those spiderweb threads. The administration was divided into highly specialized departments. There were superintendents overseeing agriculture, managing the state-owned mines, regulating the standardization of weights and measures in the market.
Basically controlling all commerce.
Yes. They were monitoring the passports of foreigners entering the trade hubs. They even had officials dedicated to maintaining municipal hygiene in the major urban centers.
Which is wild for the time period.
It was a level of centralized civic micromanagement that had never been attempted in South Asia.
And the intellectual blueprint for this entire system is a text called the Arthashastra, which is traditionally attributed to Janakya.
Yes. Although it is important to note the historical context of the text itself. The physical manuscripts we have today were likely compiled and edited into their final form several centuries later, roughly between 50 and 300 CE.
Right.
However, the core principles, the structural design of the administration, and the underlying political philosophy are widely accepted by historians as reflecting the realities of Mauryan governance established by Chanakya.
The Arthashastra is essentially a manual for ultimate statecraft. It reads less like a philosophical treatise on good and evil, and more like an instruction manual for surviving in a ruthless political ecosystem.
The defining characteristic of the Arthashastra is its stark, unflinching realism. It operates purely on the principles of realpolitik. And a key concept introduced in the text is apadharma.
Apadharma.
Yes, this principle explicitly grants the ruler the autonomy to act entirely outside the bounds of conventional morality if the security or stability of the state is threatened.
So it is the formal justification for doing whatever it takes.
Precisely. If a neighboring kingdom is plotting an invasion, or if an internal faction is fomenting rebellion, the king is not bound by ethical constraints like honesty or fair combat. Apadharma dictates that the preservation of the state is the highest possible moral good.
Which opens the door for some pretty dark tactics.
Absolutely. Therefore, the ruler is fully justified in utilizing deception, deploying assassins, utilizing poisoners, or launching an overwhelming preemptive military strike.
The text even details the creation of vast, intricate espionage networks. The Mauryan state did not just wait for information to arrive at the capital. They actively sought it out.
They employed multiple categories of spies. There were stationary spies who operated under deep cover in the hub cities, merchants who reported on market sentiments, or ascetics who listened to the grievances of the pilgrims.
Just blending in completely.
Right. Then there were roving spies, trained operatives who moved rapidly between the nodes of the spiderweb, transmitting encrypted information back to Pataliputra.
Wow, I mean, that's incredibly sophisticated.
The state even employed sleeper agents within the households of their own high-ranking officials, just to ensure that those men earning 48,000 panas remain loyal.
Trust no one, basically.
Exactly.
And this intense, pragmatic focus on control extended directly into how they built their infrastructure. It was not just about making travel convenient. It was about engineering the landscape to serve the state. The most significant example of this is the Uttarapatha.
The Uttarapatha, which translates to the Northern Road. It was a massive engineered highway that connected the northwestern frontiers regions in modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan straight through the northern plains to the imperial capital in Magadha.
But the detail that truly highlights Mauryan strategic thinking is that the Uttarapatha was specifically designed and optimized as a winter road.
Yes.
Why pour massive resources into a highway meant to be used primarily during a specific season?
The logic is a brilliant synthesis of geography, hydrology, and labor management. Consider the geography of the Northwest. The major rivers, like the Indus and its massive tributaries, are fed by Himalayan snowmelt and the summer monsoons.
So they get huge.
Right. During the summer, these rivers are raging torrents, miles wide in some places, making it incredibly dangerous and slow for large merchant caravans or military units to cross.
But during the winter months, from late October through April, the water levels drop significantly.
The rivers become sluggish and shallow. They're easily fordable. A caravan of hundreds of oxen carrying heavy loads of spices or silk can cross without needing massive specialized ferry systems.
So that is the hydrological reason.
Yes. The second reason is tied to the agricultural cycle. In the northern plains, the winter months fall between the major planting and harvesting seasons.
Ah, so the land is largely dormant.
Which means the vast majority of the population, who are peasant farmers, are not actively tied to the fields. The state suddenly has access to an immense pool of available idle labor.
So they redirect that manpower.
Yeah, exactly. The farmers are drafted into repairing the road surface, maintaining the wells along the route, and serving as porters for the state's commercial caravans.
That's incredibly efficient.
By scheduling the primary movement of goods and troops during the winter, the Mauryan administration maximized the efficiency of the environment and extracted the maximum possible labor from its subjects without disrupting the vital food supply.
It functions like a massive, highly optimized machine. You have the spy networks ensuring compliance, the bureaucrats managing the details, and the infrastructure bending the very seasons to the will of the emperor.
Right.
But this inevitably leads to a question of basic economics. Funding a network of spies, paying astronomical salaries to officials, maintaining a standing army capable of intimidating the entire subcontinent, and building continent-spanning roads requires unimaginable wealth. How did the Mauryan state physically generate and collect that much money?
They engineered an economic engine that was as ruthless as their military strategy. The foundation of this wealth was a highly regulated, intensely taxed agrarian economy. And to ensure that wealth could flow efficiently along the threads of the spiderweb, they implemented sweeping standardization.
We mentioned the punch-marked silver coins, the panas, earlier. Establishing a unified currency across such a vast territory is a massive undertaking.
And it fundamentally alters commerce. Before the Mauryas, a merchant traveling from Taxila in the northwest to Pataliputra in the east would have to cross through multiple regional territories.
With different money in each one.
Exactly. At every border, they would have to exchange their local currency for a new one, losing value to money changers at every step. By enforcing a single imperial currency, the Mauryan state removed that friction.
A silver pana held the exact same value in the foothills of the Himalayas as it did on the eastern coast.
They also standardized weights and measures. If a merchant is selling grain or purchasing raw iron, the physical weights used on the scales were mandated by the state.
So nobody could cheat the system.
It prevented local market manipulation, yes, but more importantly, it allowed the central administration to calculate taxation with precise accuracy.
Oh, right. It always comes back to taxes.
It does. The state also took direct control of agricultural infrastructure. They invested heavily in massive irrigation projects, building reservoirs and canal networks.
Which ensures a stable food supply, which prevents famine and keeps the population productive.
But the state did not build these canals purely out of benevolence. Irrigation guarantees a massive crop yield, and a massive crop yield guarantees a massive tax collection.
Of course.
The revenue was extracted relentlessly. Taxes fell squarely on the shoulders of the peasant farmers, who had to give a significant portion of their harvest to the state. Artisans in the cities were taxed on their goods, and merchants paid heavy tolls at every node along the trade routes.
There is also a very dark development specific to the Maurya period regarding labor, because to cultivate the vast tracts of state-owned land, particularly newly cleared territories, the administration relied heavily on forced labor.
Yes. Historical analysis points to a significant increase in the widespread employment of slaves in agricultural operations during this era.
Prior to this, slavery existed, but it was largely domestic, wasn't it?
It was. The Mauryan state industrialized it. They utilized prisoners of war, debtors, and marginalized groups to work massive state farms. The immense overflowing wealth of the central treasury in Pataliputra was directly fueled by the organized exploitation of human labor at the lowest tiers of society.
And amidst all this heavy taxation and state control, a fascinating social dynamic emerges. The era sees a massive boom in long-distance trade. The merchant class becomes incredibly wealthy.
They do.
And as they accumulate wealth, they begin to heavily patronize new religious movements, specifically Buddhism and Jainism, rather than the established Vedic traditions. Why is that?
It is a perfect alignment of economic necessity and religious ideology. Let us look at the traditional Vedic practices of the time. They were deeply rooted in complex rituals overseen exclusively by Brahmin priests. And a central component of many of these rituals was animal sacrifice. To appease the gods and ensure prosperity, a patron might be required to sacrifice dozens of head of cattle or horses.
But if you're a merchant whose entire livelihood depends on caravans of oxen to move goods across the Uttarapatha.
Sacrificing those animals is a direct destruction of your capital.
Exactly.
Furthermore, the Vedic system required the patron to pay hefty fees to the Brahmins to conduct the rituals. For a rising merchant class generating the empire's wealth, these practices felt like an unnecessary and burdensome drain on their resources.
So they look for an alternative.
They find it in Buddhism and Jainism. Both of these traditions emerged from the Shramana movement, which rejected the authority of the Vedas and the necessity of the Brahmin priests. Crucially, both religions strongly promoted the principle of ahimsa, or nonviolence.
Which means absolutely no animal sacrifice. You get to keep your oxen.
Precisely. They also advocated for a frugal, disciplined lifestyle, prioritizing the accumulation of merit through right action rather than expensive rituals.
From a purely economic standpoint, if a religion tells you to preserve your livestock and save your wealth, it is highly attractive to a merchant.
Additionally, these religions promoted peaceful, equitable interactions between people, regardless of their varna. If you were traveling hundreds of miles and doing business with strangers in distant hub cities, a shared ethos of nonviolence and fair dealing creates the ideal, stable conditions for long-distance trade to flourish.
The merchants build wealth, and they channel that wealth into building monasteries and supporting monks. But while the merchants are rising, what is happening to the people outside of those urban centers? Because as this massive machine grinds forward, the social stratification becomes increasingly severe.
The consolidation of the empire forced disparate groups into a rigid hierarchy. Take the people living in those empty spaces of the spiderweb we talked about, the deep forests. They were known as the Aranyachara.
The forest dwellers.
Yes. As the state expanded its agricultural land, clearing forests to build more state-run farms, they inevitably encroached on the territories of the Aranyachara.
And what happened to them?
When these tribal groups were integrated into the mainstream Mauryan economy, they were not absorbed as equals. They were forcibly grouped into the lowest, most despised castes, tasked with the most dangerous or polluting labor, such as hunting, trapping, or dealing with the dead.
We also see a significant shift for Indo-Aryan-speaking regions of the empire. As the focus on maintaining wealth and clear lines of inheritance intensified, the societal control over women tightened.
The patriarchal structure of society became deeply entrenched. The records point to the increasing prevalence of customs designed to control female autonomy.
Like what, specifically?
We see the rise of child marriage, ensuring that a woman's reproductive life is entirely managed by her father and then her husband. The dowry system also becomes more formalized, turning marriage into an explicit economic transaction between families.
And if we look back at the Arthashastra, it discusses marriage and family law with that same cold pragmatism. It explicitly views the primary function of a wife as bearing sons to continue the male lineage and inherit the family's accumulated wealth.
It is a highly instrumental view of human relationships. If we synthesize the mechanics of the era, a clear correlation emerges. The unprecedented political stability, the massive infrastructure, and the economic boom of the Maurya Empire did not happen in a vacuum.
Right.
They were directly predicated on the rigid enforcement of social hierarchies, the large-scale exploitation of agricultural labor, and the systematic marginalization of vulnerable groups. The stability at the top of the web required immense pressure at the bottom.
And that pressure holds for 2 generations. Chandragupta rules for roughly 2.5 decades. Then, according to Jain traditions, he makes a radical departure.
He abdicates.
Entirely. He embraces Jainism, travels far to the south into modern-day Karnataka, and engages in Salakana, which is a ritual fast to death, demonstrating the ultimate detachment from the material world he spent his life conquering.
His son, Bindusara, ascends to the throne. And Bindusara maintains the administrative machine and focuses his military efforts on pushing the southern borders of the empire even further into the Deccan Plateau, tightening the state's grip on the southern trade routes.
Bindusara's reign eventually comes to an end, leading to a succession struggle, out of which emerges the 3rd generation of Mauryan leadership, Ashoka, who reigned from approximately 268 to 232 BCE.
And Ashoka's reign brings the entire psychological and administrative tension of the empire to a breaking point.
Early in his reign, Ashoka operates exactly as Chanakya would have advised, right?
He does. He looks to secure a crucial vulnerability in the network. On the eastern coast lies the region of Kalinga. Kalinga was fiercely independent, maintaining a powerful military, and more importantly, it controlled vital maritime trade routes heading into Southeast Asia.
And having an independent, heavily armed state sitting right next to the imperial core in Magadha, controlling access to the sea, is an unacceptable risk for the Mauryan administration.
So Ashoka launches a massive military campaign to subjugate Kalinga. The war is successful in its objective, but the scale of the violence is unprecedented.
We actually have Ashoka's own words regarding the Kalinga War carved into stone. In his edicts, he states that 150,000 people were deported from Kalinga, 100,000 were killed in the fighting, and many times that number perished from disease and famine resulting from the campaign.
Consider the logistical reality of those numbers. Moving 150,000 captives across the subcontinent requires forced marches, starvation, and immense brutality. The Kalinga campaign was not just a battle, it was the systematic dismantling of an entire society.
And confronting the reality of that slaughter triggers a profound psychological crisis in Ashoka. He wins the war, secures the maritime routes, and then effectively suffers a breakdown when he surveys the cost.
In the very same edicts where he lists the death toll, he expresses deep, agonizing remorse for the suffering he has caused.
This moment of realization leads to his conversion to Buddhism. He abandons the policy of military expansion and declares a new philosophy of governance based entirely on Dharma.
Now, in the context of his edicts, Dharma translates to righteous conduct, social responsibility, and universal nonviolence.
But he does not just adopt this philosophy personally, he broadcasts it. He utilizes the exact same spiderweb infrastructure designed for troop movements and tax collection to disseminate his morality.
The communication strategy is highly innovative. Before Ashoka, kings might issue decrees on perishable materials like palm leaves or wood,
Which disappear over time.
Right. Ashoka demands permanence. He commissions the creation of massive monolithic stone pillars and locates large, smooth rock faces across the empire. On these surfaces, he has his moralizing edicts meticulously inscribed.
And these inscriptions are not placed in secluded temples. They are positioned directly alongside the major trade routes, at the busy intersections of the hub cities, and near the borders of the empire.
He is deliberately targeting the merchant caravans, the pilgrims, and the provincial administrators. He is ensuring that anyone traveling the threads of the Mauryan web is confronted with the emperor's new philosophy.
The content of these edicts goes far beyond standard royal decrees. They detail what you could classify today as early environmentalism. For instance, Pillar Edict 5 does not just outlaw the killing of certain animals, it explicitly forbids the burning of forests without reason.
This is a radical departure from the earlier Mauryan policy of aggressive forest clearing. Ashoka establishes protections for specific species of birds, fish, and mammals, acknowledging that the state has a responsibility to the natural environment, not just to its human subjects.
There are accounts indicating that the Buddhist monastic community took this mandate seriously, with monks actively setting controlled counterfires to prevent wildfires from devastating protected woodlands.
Ashoka's vision of Dharma also extended beyond the borders of his own empire.
He leverages the wealth of the state to sponsor extensive diplomatic and religious missions. He sends Buddhist missionaries south to Sri Lanka, northwest into the Hellenistic kingdoms, and deep into Central Asia along the early Silk Road routes.
In doing so, he transforms Buddhism from a regional philosophical sect originating in the Ganges basin into a major interregional world religion.
Let me stop right here and look at this from the perspective of the Arthashastra. You have an empire spanning millions of square miles, filled with diverse, heavily armed populations who are being taxed aggressively. The central treasury is massive, but the cost of maintaining a standing army large enough to garrison this entire subcontinent is astronomical. Is it possible that Ashoka's adoption of Dharma was not merely a spiritual awakening, but a highly calculated soft power tool?
That is one of the most significant debates among historians regarding this period. The evidence allows for both interpretations to exist simultaneously.
Because it works perfectly for state control.
Exactly. It is entirely plausible that Ashoka felt genuine remorse for the horrors of Kalinga. However, from a purely administrative standpoint, Dharma solves a massive logistical problem.
If you can convince the populace to behave peacefully, to respect authority, and to treat each other equitably, because it is the morally righteous thing to do, you do not need to pay for a garrison of soldiers in every single town.
Precisely. Brute force is expensive. The constant threat of military intervention strains the treasury and foments resentment. By promoting a universal code of ethical conduct, Dharma Ashoka was attempting to establish a shared ideological framework that transcended the localized identities of the different regions.
If the people internalize the rules, the state does not have to enforce them with a sword.
It is a far less expensive and potentially much more enduring method of maintaining social control across a fragile network.
We can actually see the physical manifestation of this immense state power in the material culture left behind. The Maurya period represents a massive cultural explosion, characterized primarily by a widespread shift to stone masonry,
Prior to this era, the vast majority of monumental architecture in the region was constructed from wood or mud brick.
which naturally decays over time.
Yes. The transition to stone is a direct result of the empire's vast resources and centralized coordination. Extracting, carving, and transporting stone requires a level of organized labor and engineering that only a stable, wealthy state can provide.
Alongside the architecture, the era is defined by a highly distinctive ceramic technology known as northern black polished ware.
This pottery has a glossy, almost metallic finish, and it is found at archaeological sites all along the major trade routes, indicating the extensive reach of the Mauryan economic network.
When historians analyze the art of the Maurya period, they generally divide it into two broad categories: court art and folk art. Let's start with court art.
Court art represents the projects driven directly by imperial patronage. The funding comes straight from the emperor's treasury. This includes the remnants of the grand, pillared palaces in Pataliputra. It includes the massive solid stone stupas, such as the core structure of the Great Stupa at Sanchi, designed to house the relics of the Buddha. And most famously, it includes Ashoka's monolithic pillars.
Those pillars are extraordinary feats of engineering. We're talking about single shafts of sandstone, often weighing up to 50 tons, quarried in specific locations like Chunar, and then dragged or floated hundreds of miles to their final destinations.
And they were polished to such a high degree that the stone actually gleams like glass.
That Mauryan polish is a signature technique of the era, demonstrating incredible artisan skill. The capitals sitting on top of these pillars were equally magnificent, usually carved in the shape of animals, bulls, elephants, or lions, representing royal power and Buddhist symbolism.
The imagery is so potent that it outlasted the empire by millennia. The lion capital of Ashoka, which originally sat atop a pillar at Sarnath, features 4 Asiatic lions standing back to back.
Today, that exact sculpture is the official state emblem of modern India. Furthermore, the base of that capital features a 24-pointed wheel, the Ashoka Chakra. That very wheel is situated in the exact center of the modern Indian national flag.
The fact that a modern nation-state reaching for symbols of unity and authority reaches back over 2,000 years to the iconography of the Maurya Empire demonstrates the profound, enduring impact of their visual propaganda.
But the court art is only half the story. The state builds pillars, but the everyday people are making their own art.
That brings us to folk art. While the emperor is focused on massive monuments and Buddhist edicts, the local artisans are producing work that reflects the grassroots culture. This includes smaller stone sculptures of local deities, intricately carved rock-cut caves used by ascetic monks, and the everyday pottery.
One specific artifact categorized under folk art that offers a glimpse into the minds of the everyday populace is the ringstone.
Ringstones are small, circular pieces of stone, typically only a few inches across, with a hole in the center. What makes them significant is the microcarving on their surface. They are incredibly detailed, and they frequently depict female figures associated with fertility, vegetation, and localized mother goddesses.
Which brings us right back to the beginning of our discussion. The mother goddesses, the Saptamatrikas, that Chanakya manipulated during the siege.
Exactly. The ringstones serve as hard archaeological evidence that while the imperial court in Pataliputra was officially sponsoring Buddhism and constructing monumental stupas, the ancient localized belief systems continued to thrive vigorously among the common people.
The Mauryan state apparatus was a heavy overlay upon the subcontinent, but it did not erase the complex, diverse religious life that existed beneath it.
It was an overlay that ultimately could not sustain its own weight. Ashoka rules for nearly 4 decades, but following his death in 232 BCE, the spiderweb begins to vibrate, and then it rapidly begins to tear apart.
The decline of the Maurya Empire is remarkably swift. Within a mere 50 years of Ashoka's passing, the empire collapses entirely, culminating in the assassination of the final Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, around 185 BCE.
He was assassinated during a military parade by his own commander-in-chief, Pushyamitra Shunga, who then established the Shunga dynasty. But the assassination was merely the final blow to an entity that had already rotted from the inside out.
The collapse of the Maurya Empire is a classic study in multifaceted systemic failure. Let us break down the causes. The most immediate factor seems to be a catastrophic financial crisis.
We discussed the immense costs of the empire earlier, the massive salaries for the turf the bureaucrats, the extensive spy networks, the constant maintenance of the infrastructure, and most importantly, the enormous standing army.
Right during the expansionist phases of Chandragupta and Bindusara, the state acquired new territories, bringing in massive influxes of captured wealth to offset these costs.
But Ashoka stops the expansion. After Kalinga, he renounces war. The borders become static.
When expansion stops, the influx of new, plundered wealth stops. But the administrative costs do not decrease.
In fact, they likely increased as Ashoka funded his massive public works, missionary expeditions, and the construction of thousands of stupas and pillars. The central treasury simply could not extract enough revenue from the existing agricultural base and trade tolls to sustain the weight of its own bureaucracy. The state went bankrupt.
Compounding the financial ruin was a severe ideological backlash. The state had heavily patronized Buddhism and Jainism for decades. The traditional elites were not happy about being sidelined.
This is often referred to as the Brahmanical reaction. The Brahmins had lost significant social privilege, political influence, and financial income due to the state's pivot away from Vedic sacrifices. Their resentment fostered deep internal instability, weakening the societal cohesion that the early empire had ruthlessly enforced.
And while the core is dealing with bankruptcy and internal dissent, external pressures begin to mount on the frontiers.
The later Mauryan rulers, perhaps distracted by internal politics or lacking the strategic vision of their predecessors, neglected the crucial northwest frontier. The passes through the Hindu Kush Mountains were left vulnerable.
This allowed the Indo-Greek kingdom, successors to the Bactrian Greeks, to cross the mountains and establish a strong foothold in the Punjab region around 180 BCE.
Once that northwestern node is compromised, the entire network begins to fail. The central authority in Pataliputra is too weak to send an army to repel the Greeks.
Seeing the weakness at the center, the ambitious provincial governors and local rulers stationed at the other nodes of the web seized the opportunity. They stopped sending tax revenue back to the capital.
They assert their own independence, taking direct control of the vital trade routes within their regions. The long legs of the spider web snap, and the subcontinent rapidly fragments back into a landscape of competing regional kingdoms.
It is a profound historical irony. The exact mechanisms designed to ensure absolute centralized control, the unimaginably expensive bureaucracy, the massive standing military, the complex intelligence networks, became the very financial and logistical burden that crushed the empire.
Despite its rapid collapse, the long-term legacy of the Mauryan state is indelible. They fundamentally altered the political imagination of South Asia. They proved that unification of the disparate regions was logistically possible.
They created a comprehensive administrative and bureaucratic template that would serve as the blueprint for future dominant states.
Centuries later, the Gupta Empire, under rulers like Chandragupta II, would utilize the core administrative frameworks established by the Mauryas, adjusting them to rely on a more decentralized approach to regional governance.
Not to mention the cultural legacy. Ashoka's decision to send missionaries outward literally altered the religious and cultural trajectory of the entire Asian continent.
The Mauryan era set a political and cultural benchmark that subsequent dynasties would continually look back to, either seeking to replicate their vast territorial control or to emulate their architectural and ideological grandeur.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to consider regarding the nature of history itself. Throughout our discussion, we have primarily examined this era from the perspective of the imperial center. We focused on the edicts carved in stone, the salaries of the highest officials, and the grand strategies of Chanakya.
We mapped the threads of the spider web.
But consider those empty spaces again. Consider the deep, inaccessible forests, the arid zones, and the independent tribal enclaves that existed right in the middle of the empire's claimed territory. How much of the historical narrative is dictated purely by the centralized states who possess the resources to carve their versions of reality into stone?
We know about the 50-ton pillars, but what was the lived, undocumented experience of the people existing off the grid? The individuals who actively and successfully resisted the reach of the Mauryan tax collectors and the silent infiltration of Chanakya's spies.
It highlights the limits of imperial power and the limits of the historical record. The silence regarding those autonomous zones is a powerful reminder that an empire's claim to total control is often an illusion written by the victors. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.